They placed a bowl of sharp stones in front of a mother while her baby laughed, and the whole town watched. In the dusty town of Bakori, beneath the scorching northern sun, a woman named Anina stood accused. The day felt heavy, like a drum beat that would not stop. The sand clung to her feet, and the air tasted dry, as if the sky itself had closed its lips. Her only crime was that she carried life in her womb while her husband had long abandoned her. People called it shame, but she called it survival. She held her child, Mercy, close to her chest, and her heartbeat tried to stay brave. Faces crowded around her like walls that moved and hissed. Men stood with hard eyes. Women stood with soft tears. Children tried to see but did not understand. Everyone came to look, to judge, to whisper, to choose. In that harsh circle, Anina felt alone, but she stood tall, her back straight, her lips steady. The wind carried dust that stung like tiny bites, yet she did not step back. She looked at the elders. She looked at the judge. She looked at the sky. Her silence spoke. It said she would not beg for pity. It said she would fight, even if her voice shook like a leaf. The elders gathered, their eyes sharp and their voices heavy with tradition. They wore fine robes and old pride. Joseph stood first, his chin high, his words firm, as if truth lived only inside his mouth. John nodded beside him, lips tight, eyes cold, hands folded like hard stone. Ruth kept her gaze down, troubled, her fingers twisting her scarf, heart torn between rule and mercy. "She has committed adultery," they declared. "The law is clear. She must die by stoning." Their words landed like stones before any hands could throw. The crowd buzzed. Some felt safe inside old rules. Some felt a storm rising in their chests. Anina stood still, the world louder than her breath. Mercy whimpered. The elders did not look at the child. They looked at the law like it was a mountain that could not move. In their posture was fear, fear of change, fear of shame, fear of losing grip on the old ways that gave them power. In their decision was a test. It asked the town to choose between the past and the future, between pride and love, between punishment and mercy. The marketplace fell silent. The tomatoes sat red and still. The peppers flashed bright but had no voice. Baskets paused mid-air in the hands of sellers, and coins forgot how to sing. Children whispered. Their words were thin like thread, trying to stitch sense where there was none. Women wept, their tears falling like quiet rain on dust. Men sharpened stones with trembling hands, and the sound was like sharp teeth grinding in the throat of the day. Everyone waited for a step, a sign, a change. But none came. Rebecca pressed her hands to her head and asked where kindness had gone. She looked at Mercy and saw a future, not a crime. Paul stood by, uniform stiff, duty heavy, eyes unsure. Victor held his recorder low, unsure when a story becomes a wound. Esther felt her throat burn with a song she had not yet dared to sing. The air had a taste of fear. It moved through the stalls and the buckets and the talk. And it rested on the shoulders of people who did not want to be cruel but were scared to be brave. Anina, her face pale yet proud, held her baby close to her chest. Mercy's tiny fingers grabbed her mother's scarf and pulled, as if trying to hold the world together with a small grip. The child's soft cries pierced the silence louder than the judge's thunder. Anina rocked the baby and hummed a small tune her mother used to sing, a song like cool water over hot sand. Her eyes were tired but clear. She had walked through fire before. She had faced a husband's silence, a family's anger, a town's gossip. She had learned that survival is a long road with sharp stones, and still she walked. Today the road turned into a place of judgment, and yet she stood. Mama Ruth, her aunt, watched from the back, lips moving in prayer, heart breaking in each beat. Anina whispered to Mercy, "You are not a mistake. You are a blessing." The crowd heard her words, but pretended not to. They felt those words in their bones and felt ashamed. Some turned away. Some held tighter to their stones. The local judge, stern and unyielding, struck the table with his staff. Justice Peter had a face like carved rock and a voice that cut the air clean. "The evidence is before us," he said. "The child is proof. She is guilty." The words were heavy. They did not bend. They fell like a gate shutting out fresh wind. Mary, the court clerk, glanced at Anina and then at the judge. She saw fear, not just strength, in his eyes, the fear of losing control, the fear of loosening rules that held his world together. The staff hit the wood again. Mercy flinched and cried. Anina kissed her forehead. David stepped forward in the crowd, face calm, eyes sharp, mind already running. Grace stood near him, fingers clenched, anger hot and ready. The judge called for order, but the air would not listen. It hummed with a different kind of law, the law of human hearts, the law of common sense, the law that says a mother's love is not a crime. Gasps filled the air. Some nodded in agreement, bound by the strict code of law. Others lowered their heads, troubled by a sentence that smelled more of blood than of justice. Joseph stood like a fence, unmoved. John clenched his jaw. Ruth's eyes watered, a small river in a hard land. The people were divided, but their hearts were one thing, restless. Even the goats outside seemed to pause and listen, as if the earth itself wanted to know what kind of town Bakori would be after this day. Esther felt a drum in her chest. It told her to stand and sing, but her legs shook. Rebecca wanted to shout, "This is wrong!" but her mouth felt heavy. Paul's hand touched his baton, then let it go, unsure of who he was serving, law or truth. Victor clicked his recorder on and off, his fingers tapping anxiety. Something was shifting. It was small. It was brave. It was necessary. Anina spoke, her voice shaking yet firm. "I am a mother. If I die, who will feed this child? Who will teach her mercy in a world that knows only stones?" Her words were simple, but they caught fire. They burned through the silence and the pride and the old lines drawn in dusty books. She did not talk of law. She did not talk of rules. She talked of hunger, of warmth, of hands that hold, of words that heal, of nights that scare a child, of mornings that need a smile to start. Mercy looked at her and then at the crowd, as if she knew she was the center of this storm. Anina's eyes found Ruth, and for a moment that elder's heart answered with a small yes inside. But fear had a loud voice. The judge's face tightened. He lifted his staff. David felt his body move forward, a choice inside him becoming a step. Grace touched Anina's shoulder and nodded, a promise passing from one woman to another. But her pleas were drowned by the crowd's chant, "Stone her! Stone her!" The chant grew from a few mouths to many. It rolled like a wave and crashed on the walls. It tried to wash away doubt. It tried to drown mercy. Men raised their stones high, faces hard to read. Were they angry, scared, or just carried by the crowd? Women covered their faces and cried. Children stepped back. The chant pressed in like a storm that does not listen to reason. Anina held Mercy tighter. She did not bow her head. She looked at the eyes that shouted and chose not to hate them. She chose to pity them, because hate would make her weak, and pity would make her kind. Grace shouted back, her voice fighting the roar. "Stop! Stop!" Her words came out like a small boat in a wild river. David raised his hand and tried to speak, but the noise was a wall. In the crowd, however, whispers began to rise, voices of defiance. The whispers were small at first, like rising smoke that people try to fan away. Then they gathered, and they burned clear. David stood tall. He stepped onto an old wooden bench and shouted, "This punishment is not justice. It is cruelty in the name of law." His words cut the chant into pieces and made people listen. His suit was dusty, his shoes were worn, he did not carry a sword. He carried truth, and truth felt strong in his hands. The law is not a stone. The law is not a stone you throw at mothers, David said, his voice steady, his eyes burning with conviction. The law is a shelter that keeps families safe. The crowd shifted. Bodies turning, eyes finding him, minds waking. Even Joseph felt a tremor inside. Ruth stopped twisting her scarf. She listened with her whole face. Justice Peter frowned, angry at a voice that challenged him in public. But the day had changed. David's voice did not need permission to be right. It needed courage, and courage showed up like morning light. Anina breathed easier. Her hope small but warm, as if someone had finally stepped into the storm to stand beside her. Grace stepped forward, her eyes blazing like fire. If this law kills mothers, who will nurture tomorrow? Mercy is not weakness. It is strength. Her words struck the crowd like lightning. She told them of her own mother, who had raised 5 children with nothing but grit and kindness, who had fed neighbors when her own pot was empty. "If you stone mothers," Grace cried, "you stone the heart of the town." The words spread like sparks. Deborah, the pastor, nodded and lifted her hands in prayer. Isaac, the imam, raised his voice and said, "Mercy is not against the law. Mercy is the spirit of it." Esther began to hum a song, soft but steady, and the crowd's chant faltered. Justice Peter slammed his staff, but the sound was weaker now. Grace's fire had lit something that could not be put out. Letters came from across Nigeria. They arrived like rain that begins small and then becomes a river that cannot be ignored. Religious leaders, scholars, and strangers cried out, "No! The law cannot eat its own children. Justice must protect, not destroy." Victor spread the story on radio, his voice carrying Anina's name into homes far beyond Bakori. People in Lagos, Port Harcourt, Enugu, and Kano heard and felt something stir. Benjamin, the governor's aide, tracked the rising tide of outrage and warned his superiors, this case could break the nation's trust. Deborah wrote an open letter calling for compassion. Isaac visited the elders and reminded them that faith without mercy is empty. Rebecca read the letters aloud in the market, her voice trembling but strong. The town felt the weight of the world pressing in. International eyes turned toward Bakori. Newspapers wrote, radios roared, and the world watched as one woman stood between life and death. Cameras arrived, pointing at faces that had never been filmed before. Some people hid. Some stepped closer. Victor guided the reporters, careful not to turn pain into spectacle. They asked why a baby must prove guilt. They asked how a mother becomes a target. They asked where mercy lived in this town. Paul, the policeman, felt the world's gaze heavy on his uniform. Esther led students in a rally, their placards painted with bold words, "Let mercy live." Grace spoke to the cameras, her voice unshaken. David filed petitions late into the night. The elders saw their faces on screens. Justice Peter felt his name under headlines. The world wanted a story, but what it really wanted was justice. Justice Peter, unmoved, reaffirmed his verdict. She must die. His voice cracked like thunder and people flinched. He spoke of order, of duty, of fear that mercy would unravel the law. Joseph clapped softly. John nodded, but their applause felt hollow, like clapping for a song no one wanted to hear. Ruth lowered her eyes and wept. Mary, the clerk, wrote the words with a heavy pen. The staff struck the table again. Mercy cried. Anina did not tremble. She shifted her baby and stood firm. Her stillness unsettled the judge. For in her silence, he saw not weakness, but strength, and it frightened him. Anina whispered, "If I must die, let my child live to see a kinder world." Her words were soft, but they carried iron. Mercy touched her mother's chin and smiled, as if innocence itself had chosen to defy the court. Grace clenched her fists, holding back tears. David closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with resolve. Deborah and Isaac stood side by side, a rare picture of unity, their faces calm but fierce. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some looked at their stones and wondered if their hands could still throw them. Anina's words planted seeds, seeds of mercy, seeds of courage, seeds of change. Then came the appeals. Higher courts in Kaduna were petitioned. David led the charge, his arguments sharp but simple. This is a mother. This is a child. The law must protect life, not destroy it. Grace gathered signatures and stories, carrying them to doors that resisted her knocks. Victor sent updates across the nation. Mary slipped a kind note into the file, a whisper inside the system. Benjamin tracked the growing storm of public opinion. Deborah prayed with the fearful. Isaac preached mercy late into the night. Anina rocked her baby and told her stories of stars and futures. The appeals were not just papers, they were people. The legal battle raged. Some judges clung to tradition, but others dared to ask, what is the spirit of the law, if not to serve life? Justice John read the case and thought of his own mother, who had fought hunger to keep him alive. He wondered if a law that kills mothers is a law that has lost its soul. David argued that mercy is wisdom, not weakness. Grace spoke of a future where the law protects instead of punishes. The higher court felt the weight of the nation pressing on it. They knew the world was watching. They knew Bakori was waiting. They knew a baby named Mercy was breathing in their silence. Activists marched. Mothers carried placards. Students sang in protest. Their voices became a storm that could not be ignored. The streets of Kaduna filled with color and sound. Esther stood on a truck bed and led chants. "Mercy is strength," the crowd shouted back. Grace walked with old women and young boys, pastors and imams, journalists and shopkeepers. Victor streamed clips that made hearts race. Rebecca sent baskets of food to the marchers. Paul watched from the edge and did not stop them, because he had chosen to serve life. The streets carried drumbeats and prayers. It was not anger that moved them. It was love mixed with duty. Finally, the higher court gathered. Learned men and women sat in silence, the weight of history on their shoulders. Samuel, the chief judge, looked over the room and saw more than faces. He saw a country at a bend in the road. Justice John cleared his throat. Mary stood ready with her pen. David arranged his papers and met Anina's eyes, a promise passing between them. Grace folded her arms, steady but fierce. Deborah and Isaac sat together, unity stronger than labels. The room was full, but silence held it like a sacred hand. Outside, the crowd waited, their voices humming like a living drum. Arguments were heard. Some said the law must stand, even if it kills. They spoke of order, of fear, of rules that cannot bend. Others argued that the law without mercy is nothing but cruelty carved in stone. David stood and said, "A law that cannot protect a mother is a law that has lost itself." He gave reason, he gave heart. Grace spoke of the people in the streets, their hope, their courage. Justice John asked careful questions, listening with an open mind. Samuel weighed the arguments not only with his mind, but with his soul. The room felt the edge of change. Samuel rose. His voice was slow, but it carried across the room. "This judgment cannot stand. The sentence of death is overturned." The words cut the chain that bound the day. For a second, no one spoke. Then sound returned like rain after drought. A gasp, then a cry, then a wave of joy. Anina closed her eyes and held Mercy close. David covered his mouth, fighting tears. Grace squeezed Deborah's hand. Isaac whispered thanks. Justice John felt his chest open. Mary wrote the words with a light hand. Samuel reminded them, Mercy is part of law, not outside it. The point of judgment is to protect life, not destroy it. In that moment, stones slipped from the hands of the people. Fingers let go. Palms opened. The stones fell soft onto the ground, ashamed of themselves. Some wept, others rejoiced. The dust of violence settled. Joseph stared at his empty hands. John looked away. Ruth smiled through tears. Paul felt relief flood his chest. Esther sang a bright song. Rebecca hugged strangers. Victor recorded faces, not for spectacle, but for memory. The hall breathed. The town breathed. Anina stood quiet in the middle of it all, not proud, not loud. She was grateful, and her gratitude made the room feel holy. Mercy giggled, and the sound was like bells that made fear step back. Anina fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling as if the weight of the entire world had just been lifted from her shoulders. For so long she had carried fear like a heavy stone in her chest. But now that stone had cracked and rolled away. Mercy giggled in her arms, the sound pure and bright, as if innocence itself had triumphed over cruelty. That laugh was not just a child's laugh, it was a declaration, a reminder that life had chosen to bloom even in the harshest desert. Strong men who had sharpened stones earlier now wiped their eyes, ashamed of what they had almost done. Women who had wept in silence now wept with relief, their tears washing away the dust of despair. Grace rushed forward and knelt beside Anina, wrapping her arms around her, whispering, "You are free, sister. You are free." David stood a few steps back, his eyes wet, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of victory. Deborah placed her hand on Anina's shoulder and prayed softly, while Isaac bowed his head in gratitude. The courtroom, once a place of fear, now felt like a sanctuary. The air was lighter, the walls brighter, as if mercy itself had walked in and taken a seat. When Anina rose to her feet, she did not rise as a criminal who had been spared. She rose as a mother whose courage had shaken a nation. The sun met her at the doorway of the court, spilling golden light across her face, as if the heavens themselves had been waiting to crown her with warmth. The dust swirled around her feet, but it no longer stung her eyes. It danced, as though celebrating her freedom. People reached out to touch her hand, not to claim her story, but to share in it. Esther handed her a flower, its petals trembling in the breeze, a symbol of fragile but enduring hope. Rebecca pressed a loaf of bread into her hands, whispering, "For you and Mercy, so you will never go hungry again." Paul, the policeman, offered to walk beside her, not as an enforcer of law, but as a protector of peace. David walked quietly at her side, his presence steady, his silence saying more than words ever could. Grace lifted her chin and reminded the crowd, "This is not the end. This is the beginning of a new way." Anina stepped slowly, Mercy asleep in her arms, and the town looked different. Not because the buildings had changed, but because the hearts inside them had taken a brave step toward light. Her story spread like wildfire, carried on tongues, papers, and screens. From village squares to city halls, people spoke of the woman who had faced the stones and lived. Teachers told her story in classrooms, reminding children that justice without compassion is no justice at all. In markets, women repeated her words, "If I must die, let my child live." And those words became a shield for mothers everywhere. In churches and mosques, leaders preached her courage, reminding their congregations that mercy is not weakness, but strength. Benjamin, the governor's aide, carried reports to his superiors, warning them that the people were awake now, that they would no longer accept laws that broke families apart. Grace organized circles of learning, where people gathered to read the judgment in simple words, to understand that mercy could live inside the law. David drafted guides for courts, showing how compassion could strengthen justice instead of weakening it. Victor wrote articles that did not sensationalize but humanized, painting Anina not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. Meanwhile, Anina stayed home, rocking Mercy, feeding her, whispering stories of stars and futures. Mama Ruth watched over them, her old eyes shining with pride. The story did not end in Bakori. It grew, it traveled, it became a mirror for the nation. The law is a sword, but mercy is its handle. A sword without a handle cuts the innocent, leaving wounds that never heal. Remember this: when law forgets mercy, it becomes cruelty, and cruelty destroys the very people it was meant to protect. In Bakori, they almost lost a mother to a rule that had forgotten its heart. They almost lost a child to a crowd that had forgotten its eyes. But voices rose, hearts woke, and courage moved like warm wind through the land. Mercy walked into the room and sat down. And once Mercy sat, cruelty had to leave. If you ever find yourself holding a stone, ask your hands a question. Is this stone stronger than love? If the answer is no, put it down. If the answer is yes, check your heart again, because real strength is not found in the force that breaks, but in the care that binds. Anina lived, Mercy lived, and from that day forward, the law in Bakori learned how to hold its sword with a kinder hand. And so the tale is told, not just as history, but as a warning and a guide, that justice without compassion is no justice at all.